Hey, welcome back to part 2 of rebuilding Amie's website. And today we're finally also gonna animate the main Spotify card. If we quickly take a look at what we built last time, which you can see here on the Frontend FYI website, you see that we created the basic structure of the website, but also added all of the scrolling animations where you see that a specific card gets activated based on its scroll position. And today, we're actually gonna add this Spotify card. This card is already the end result of today's video, and what we'll be adding is this card, but also what happens when you click on it. If you click on it, everything animates out of the way in different timings, in different ways, and this main card pops up. But also, this Spotify bar here animates into the card and morphs back and forth between the two states. These things are what we are gonna build today, and I really hope you're ready for this because it brings so many nice animations again. Let's start building right away. So looking at Amie's website, I think the first thing we have to do is make this card. Because right now we only show gradient in the background. And of course we still need to add these album covers, we need to add the Spotify element. We're not gonna add the hover yet though. Maybe part 3 is coming? Let me know in the comments if you would like that. So we'll focus on adding the album cover, adding the Spotify element without the interactivity, as well as the show me button. I think that would be a nice first step. So let's open up our card component again. And in there, we find our music card. And like we did in the previous video, I added already some children in there. And for now, there was an empty span for each card. But for this Spotify card, we're now gonna add some images in there. And these images I already added in the public directory, song 1, 2, 3, as well as the window we're gonna use in a second. So we can directly use these images already. So we can simply add them in by adding image, source, and then referencing song-1.webp. And we can do that for the second one and the third one as well. And if we do that and we go back to our own rebuild, we already see that we have some images there. Let's give them a class name as well, so we can make them rounded extra large, as well as give them a shadow of large to look a little bit better. And then we also need to position them, of course. All of them will be position absolute, and then they all have different widths and positioning, and that's something I'm gonna copy in from my right side. So with these positions added, they're all positioned within the square with an absolute positioning. And you can imagine that we can do something similar for all of the other cards. Instead of adding a span in there, we could add images, we could add texts, and that way we could create all of the different card components. So the final thing that's still missing is actually the green Spotify div. So for that, I'm also gonna copy in an SVG, which is the Spotify logo. And then we're also gonna give this a class name. And let me look to my right again. We're gonna position this absolute on left 40% and top of 32. And then it has a height of 48, a width of 24. And we're gonna make this 96 pixels of border radius and also have a shadow. And that way you already see that the element is positioned in the center. The only thing that's still missing is also the green background, of course. So this background color, we're going to use a custom hex color because we're not reusing that anywhere. And we're also adding padding 3, so the logo gets pushed in a little bit. And with that, we already recreated this card component. And if we scroll, we just see that the contents fades in and we can see all of these different elements. And that's pretty much the only thing we need to do to style this card. This is the only contents, except from the player that we're not gonna add right now, that this card has. And if we scroll to another one, we see that it fades out, and we go back, it simply fades in. Now, the next thing we have to do is also add this button. And if you then click that show me button, it animates into a full screen view that shows a screenshot, and you also see that all of the elements animate in and disappear. And even this Spotify playing element that moves into place into the other screenshot. So first things first, and that is adding that show me button. So we also can create a full screen view. This button we can also add within our feature card component. So that way we don't need to repeat it for every card, but as long as you use the feature card component, you're good to go, you get that button included. So let's start by adding a basic button in there that has the text show me. Then we're gonna add a class name again. So we can add a background of black and also give it a text white and a rounded actual large. And then we're gonna position this absolute with a bottom of 6 and a right of 6, for example. So that way it's positioned at the bottom right. And let's also add a padding X of 4 and a padding Y of 2. So the button has a bit more breathing room. And also we're gonna add the shadow large again. And like that, we also have a button that's actually available on every card because it is simply within the feature card component. Now the next thing is that we need to add an on click to this button that makes a card full screen. So when I was first looking at Amie's website and I saw this, that you can click on it and you see that there's an image over top and there's also an, for example, escape button you can click to exit out of it again. I thought this is a perfect use case of the HTML dialog element that I made a video about last week as well, linked up there. But the thing is, if you look at this animation, the screenshot lies underneath the rest of the animation, simply because the elements need to transition into the screenshot. If I would use the HTML dialog element, everything would lie on top because the dialog is always the topmost element. So unfortunately, even though it would be really easy to implement this with the dialog, that's not gonna happen because then we cannot recreate this animation. So instead of using the dialog, we're gonna use a regular div that we're gonna fade in and fade out. So that means that we actually, before we can do anything with that button, we need to have the div that we can fade in and fade out. So first we're gonna go back to our app because in there we then need to add all of the large visuals as well. And because this image is always fixed within the center, I think we can simply add it right here. We can create a new div that actually is position fixed, so it's always within the center of your screen, and it then just fades in and out. So let's first start by creating a new component called visual that we can render here for every visual we have, just like we also do with the feature title and feature card. So I'm gonna go ahead and create a new component in the features directory, and we're gonna call this visual. And for that, we're again gonna create a new component called visual, and that will then return a div with our visual in there. Of course, like we do with the card as well, we probably want to render some children in here, so we can render a custom visual for every different item. But the whole wrapper, the positioning and everything will be shared, so that's why I'm creating a visual component that we will reuse in a second, just like we're doing with the feature card as well. We're gonna create a new type of visual props, and that will then get children that are of a React node. So that way we can destructure the children here again, and instead of rendering visual, we can render the children. And then we can create a new variable called music visual, and this then uses our visual component, and in there renders an image that you can see in the public directory of window-Spotify. So that way, again, we're using the same wrapper every time, so we don't need to repeat any CSS class names we set, but the contents, in this case an image, and later maybe even more, is something we can make different for every visual. So that visual we're gonna export. And then for now, we're gonna render this music visual so we can see what we're doing. And if we now look at our left, we see nothing, but that is because it's rendered on top. And it also is because I probably made a typo. That's correct, it's a WebP. And if we do that, we see that the image is there, but it's just always at the top of the page, and that's not what we want. But that is because we also said we wanted to make this position fixed. And if we give this an inset of 0, then it's also centered at the page. But you also see now that the image is not centered, and that is because by default, the image won't center within the div. So for that, we can also add display flags and make it item center and justify center. So everything is centered within the page. What you also still see is that the image stretches to the full width because we don't set any max width. So let's also add another wrapper around here where we use the same max width as we use on the wrapper for the page, which is a max width of 5 extra large. So that way everything is put in the center as well. And I already saw that the image was smaller than the text, and that is we're actually using a width of 6 extra large and not 5. So let's change that. And then the other thing we also need to take in is the padding on the x-axis of 4. Because if we combine those two, then the width of the image is always exactly the same as the width of the main body text. And if we keep on scrolling, the image will always stay in the center because it's position fixed. But we can use this to our advantage because that way the image will always fade in from the center in a second. So let's first render all of the different images for every visual, and then we're gonna hide the image and fade the correct one in. So instead of making 6 more visuals, I'm actually gonna create a variable called other visual. That will also simply render the Spotify image, so that way we don't need to create 25 other visuals. In a second, we'll be adding some other elements within this visual, so there will be a difference between the two of them. So if we then go back to our app, we can add a new variable called visual, where we add other visual to all of them except the music one. This will be music visual. And then instead of hard-coding music visual here, we're again gonna map over our features. That gives us a feature. And then this time we're gonna render feature.visual with the key set again. And that for now will simply show us all of these visuals right on top of each other because they're all position fixed again. So for now, I'm also gonna make all of them opacity 0 so we don't see them. However, you can still kind of interact with them. If they have clickable elements, then stuff could still happen. So it's also important to add pointer events none, so that way you cannot interact with the div at all. And now we have all these visuals in place, the next step is making one active. So we need to do something when you click on this button, because right now we only know which element is in view based on the scroll position. But on top of that, we should also know which element is actually clicked and became full screen. So for that, I'm actually gonna go back to our store again. And if you didn't see part 1, definitely check that because there we set up this store and I explain you why I think it's really useful. And what I'm gonna add here is next to the in view feature, I'm also gonna add a full screen feature. So let's copy this and then we're gonna rename in view to full screen feature. And then we're gonna let Copilot do its thing. Yes, it already knows what we want. Perfect. So that way we now also have a value and a function within our store via which we can set one element to being full screen. So if we now go back to our card component and then we go to our feature card, we can get this function here that says const set full screen feature is use feature store state, and then we take the set full screen feature function. So this way we can use that function to set a value in the store again. And where are we going to do that? On the button click, of course. If you click that button, we're gonna call this function with the ID that you're currently clicking. So that way, clicking the button sends the value in the store, and then the only thing we need to do within the visual component is check, am I full screen currently? Yes, then you're gonna fade in. No, then you're gonna fade out again. So then we need to do one more thing, of course, and that is also take in the ID within the visual component so it can check itself. So for that, because I'm using TypeScript again, I'm gonna create another interface or type that takes in the ID as a string. The visual is also gonna use that. And then we're gonna get the ID here, as well as in the other visual. And we're also gonna pass that in here. So that way the visuals get the ID and they pass it to the visual wrapper component as well, so that can use it. And then we also in our app component need to set this ID to feature.id as well. So that way all of them know the ID. And then within our visual component, we can simply, instead of always setting opacity 0, we can do something with that opacity. So if we again take in our class names, and then we need to import that, then we can simply also import our full screen feature from the store again by importing the full screen feature. We also need to import the store and also destructure the ID here. Then we can say if full screen feature equals ID, then opacity is 100. Otherwise opacity is 0, and then we have pointer events none. So this way we can remove the pointer events by default, because if they're not active, they get the pointer events none. And otherwise there's no pointer event set, which means that the thing is clickable. Also remove the opacity here and add a comma. And if we then scroll to our element and click the show me button, we see that one element becomes visible. We can still add a transition opacity to this and then refresh. And then you see that it fades in. So this full screen variable we're now going to use to fade in the right element when you click. And it's not only fading in elements, it's also fading out elements, because these cover images, they also disappear as soon as the screenshot becomes visible. So we're going to use this variable in a few places to make things work. And if we quickly jump over to Amie's website again, you see that there's a lot happening and also things happening at different intervals. So instead of using a normal transition here, we're actually going to use frame motion sequences right now. So I only added this full screen feature here to demonstrate you that we can read this value now and can do something with it. But we're actually going to animate this visual with a frame motion animation sequences, because that way we can put all of the animations in one place without needing to go through multiple components to find what's animating when and adding custom delays, because the animation sequences make it really easy to see these orders and dependencies of things. So let's start by adding a few of these animations in. For now, I'm still going to leave this fade in here for a second, but in a minute we also need to remove that. But the first thing I actually want to do is whenever an element becomes full screen, I want to animate out the text on the left side. So let's start by adding the frame motion use animate hook. That use animate hook returns an array with two values in there. The first one is the scope and the second one is an animate function. This scope is a ref that you should set on any wrapper div of the elements you want to animate. So that means that for now I'm going to add another wrapper div around both the visual images as well as the two column view. And on there, we are gonna set this ref equal to scope. So this way, any element in here, we can target with a normal query selector and we can animate. And if you want to learn more specifically about these animation sequences, definitely check the video linked up here, because there I explain things way more in depth than I can do in this video. So the next step for animating is that this animation should happen when there is a full screen visual. So that means that we need to get our full screen feature from our store. So that way we can run an effect that triggers the animation if it's visible or not. So let's also add a use effect where as a dependency, we're gonna set our full screen feature. So this way we can do an if statement in here. And if full screen, we animate everything out. And otherwise we know that we're coming back from full screen to the normal view and we animate everything back in place. So like I said a minute ago, this animate function can simply work with a query selector. So that means that we can run this animate function, and in here, the first argument could be a class name. For example, feature title. And that way we can target any element within our scope that has the class name feature title, and then we can run an animation on it. So we first need to add this class name. So let's quickly go to our feature title, and then we go to our paragraph and we add a class name feature title. So this way we can use that class name to target our element. And then in this animate function, the first argument is that class name, but the second argument is an object. And that object can contain any animation you want to do. For example, if we're going full screen, we want to fade all of these titles out. So that means we can add opacity 0. And I also want to animate them slightly to the left. So I can also add an X of minus 200 pixels. And then the other way around, if we're going back from full screen, we want to animate everything back to 1 and an X of 0. So this way, if we now click this button, you see that the text moved to the left and faded out. And we did that by adding this really declarative way of adding our animations. So it's really clear what happens because everything is in one place. And now we can still add a third argument to this. And the third argument can take some settings for your animation. For example, we can add a duration of 0.3. And we do the same for the fading in again. And one thing we can also add is a delay. So you could add a delay of 0.2, which would just delay everything with 200 milliseconds. But we can also here import a function called stagger from FrameRemotion. And what this function does is, if there's multiple elements, like our feature title, it will delay all of them with a specific duration. So if I would add 0.05, it would delay every item with 50 milliseconds. But that means that the second one is delayed with 50 milliseconds, the third one with 100, then 150. So you get this staggered effect. So let's also add that to our fading in again. And if we then refresh this and click, you should see on the left side that they move to the left one by one. And it's pretty quickly because our visual's still fading in. So let's just remove this for a second and make it opacity 0. So that way our main visual won't fade in anymore. And if we click now, you see that everything moves one by one, only by adding this stagger function. And while we're at it, let's also add a button to go back from full screen, so that way we can toggle back and forth without constantly refreshing. So for now, I'm gonna add a button that says back to site. And we're gonna give this a class name of position fixed, bottom 0, left 50%, and then translate X of minus 50%, so it gets exactly in the middle. So that way we already have a button that we can click. We should also give this a z-index of 10, by the way, so it's on top of everything. And then when we click this button, The only thing we need to do to get into this animation is set our full screen feature to null. So if we just import that function here, const set full screen feature is use feature store, where we can get this function from the store again. We can on click of this button set that value to null. So that way, if we click this back button now, everything fades in. And we can simply click back and forth between the two of them. And the animation is automatically triggered, which is super neat, I think. So now we have this animate function in place. We can also animate the image here, because that way, again, we declare animation in one spot instead of scattered all over our website. So we already removed the animation that happened here. I'm also gonna remove the transition because that's also being done with framer motion. But I'm gonna add back in the pointer events none. And on top of that, we're also gonna need a class name to target these elements. And that class name needs to be kind of unique, but still predictable, because we want to target a specific visual belonging to a specific ID. So I'm going to add a class name visual-id. So that way we have a unique class for every visual, but I know what the ID is. So now we added that class name, we can go back to our app and we can target the animation here. We are now going to add multiple animations to this animate function, which means that we're required to pass an array in here. And it's actually an array of arrays. So every animation itself should be an array of 3 values. So that means that as the second animation, we can target our visual, but it shouldn't be the visual, but it should visual with the ID. And that ID is set in this full screen feature variable. So we can target it by running visual dash full screen feature. And then we can add the animation settings again, which is opacity 1 and scale of 1 as well, because it should actually also scale up in a minute. And then we're also gonna add pointer events auto, because then it should be able to interact. And whenever we close it, we should also fade it out again. Quickly adding both of the arrays in here. And then we can copy this animation, make the opacity 0 and the scale 0.75, and pointer events none. We should also, by the way, still update the dependencies like the ESLint is telling us right now. So let's also do that while we're at it. But after we do that and we quickly refresh and click the show me button, you see that the text fades out and the image fades in. If we click back though, the image stays in place. And the reason for that is because in our else case, our full screen feature is not set anymore. So we need to have some way to still reference this image so we know what image just went out of screen. So for that, I'm actually going to add one more value to our store. So I'm going to copy this full screen feature and we're going to call this last full screen feature. Because that way we can store an additional value in our store of the feature that was last visible. And where do we need to change that? Well, we actually want to change that when we set a full screen feature. So we want to set this as following. If we're setting a feature that's not null, we also want to set this last full screen feature. So that way we do not clear it and set it to null, but if there is a new feature being set, we do override it with the last value. If we now go back to our app and we're going to add another row where we say last full screen feature and take that correctly from the store as well. Then instead of using this full screen feature variable, we're now going to use the last full screen variable to construct the class names. We're not going to update this if statement because that should be accurate. If it's null, we should go to this animation, but if it's not, we should stay in this animation. So the if statement should still use the one that goes back to null, and this one should use the value that always stays a string. So if we quickly give this another refresh and click, we should see the animation fade in, and if we click back, we should see it fade out again. It does, however, happen at a slight delay, and that is because we can still add another property to our animation settings, and that is an add that has this arrow, and that tells us it animates at exactly the same time as our previous animation. So that way, both of them animate at exactly the same time. So if we retry this again, we see that they fade out and animate at exactly the same time. And there's only a few things left now that we also need to animate to complete this animation. The first thing, if we look at Amie's website again, is that this gradient seems to shrink into the left corner. So that's still something we have to add. And in order to shrink that card, we cannot shrink the whole card because if we go to Spotify, there's content in here. And if we would shrink that, everything would shrink with it, which is not the behavior we want. That means that there's one change we need to do in our card. And that is, instead of rendering the gradient as a background of the whole card, we need to have a separate div that is this background. So we're going to add a new div that's just an empty div and then has a class name where we're going to use our class names function. That's absolute and incent 0, and that takes in our gradient. So we can remove the gradient here. And of course, we should also copy the background gradient class name. And if we add that, we still have exactly the same result. But this time, if we open up the inspector and inspect this element, we see that we have this div that's actually a separate div. So we can target this with our animation now as well. And again, to target that, we need a class name of gradient, for example. So we can target this element. And we also need to know which card is active. So this is also the right time to add a class name of active card to our active card. And we do that based on the in-view feature. So we know which card is visible right now. And with those two classes, we can now go back to our animation and actually animate this gradient too. We can add in a new animation where we target our active card and then the gradient element within that. And we can say opacity 0 and scale 0 as well. And for the animation settings, it should also run at exactly the same time as the previous one. And then we're gonna copy this into the other animation too, where it then animates back to opacity 1 and scale 1. And of course, we need to tell it to move to the bottom left corner instead of into the center, which is the default of an animation. And to make that work, we also need to add origin bottom left to our animation. And we also still have to copy in the rounded corners, I notice right now. By doing that, we tell with this class name that it should animate to the bottom left corner. But if we now activate our full screen view, you see that the card animates into the left corner. There is, however, still a gray background visible, and that is our default gray background when there is no card active. So that's also still something we have to fix. And that we can do in our app. And for that, we actually don't need any JavaScript. We can do this with CSS only by using the has selector. And we can use that has selector by using two square brackets, then $has, where within these parentheses, we're gonna target an element that this div should have. And that should be a direct child. So we use the direct child selector, this arrow, underscore, because we can't use spaces in Tailwind, dot active card. So this way we say it should have an element that is active card. And if that is true, we're gonna say colon bg transparent. So if this selector is true, if it has an active card, then the background becomes transparent instead of gray. So if we now click this button, we don't see any gray background anymore. That is because it's now transparent. It's only not transparent when there is no active card. So when we scroll fully up, like you can see here. Next, let's also make sure that both of these buttons show up and disappear at the right time. First, the back to side button needs to become background black, of course, and text white. We also need to add a padding on the x-axis of 4 and a y of 2. And it also is a rounded full. And probably also the large shadow as well. And then by default, again, it is opacity 0. And it should also come from the bottom. So I'm also going to give this a translate Y of 300% as a default. And then we, of course, need to be able to target this. So I'm going to add a back to side button class name as well. And the same thing for the feature card. You need to be able to target them as well. So they also need a class name. That class name will be show me button. And now we can target both of them in our animations. Let's first do the show me button, which is within the active card, and then show me button. That as soon as we go full screen, it should go to opacity 0. And it should also happen at exactly the same time. Then for the back to side button, it should actually go to opacity 1 and have a Y of 0 pixels. And also that should happen at exactly the same time. Then finally, we copy this into the exit animation 2. And it's pretty much the reverse. It should be opacity 1 and the back to side button should be opacity 3 and 300 pixels on the y-axis. And if we now refresh and click that show me button, then we don't see anything because it's back to side button. But if we do that again, we see that this button is visible, but then fades out and the other one appears. And we click and they sort of toggle between the two of them. The animation of the back to side button is a bit quick, I think. So I'm gonna add a duration of 0.3 on here. And I do the same thing for the exit animation. And I also think that when you go back, this show me button shouldn't be there immediately. So I'm gonna move this show me button down in the order and remove this at. So that way it will only run once the other animations have completed. So if we try that now, it just looks a bit more natural to only have this button appear when also the gradient is back in place again. And this just looks super smooth. You could still tweak things with the duration and the easing, of course. But I think for the general animations, this is more than enough for now. The only thing that still remains, of course, is this card animation to make the albums disappear and make the Spotify element move into place. So let's start with the albums first. We go back to our card component. What we want to do here is whenever this card is full screen, we want to hide these. We want to fade them out and scale them down. So for that, we first need to look into our store for the full screen feature. Then I'm also going to create a new variable, is full screen, that checks if the full screen feature is equal to the ID. And now based on this is full screen boolean, we can change the scale of this image. First, we're going to add class names again. And then we're going to say is full screen. then it has a scale of 0, and otherwise it has a scale of 100. We also need to transition the transform, so it is animated. But that's pretty much the only thing there is to it. We of course need to add that to both of the other images as well. Doing this simply scales down all of these cards. And if we then click the card, we should see the albums fade out. But somehow that's not happening. And the reason for that, you already see that I added a console log here, is because we're actually toggling the theme image. And that is because all of the cards are clickable, although not visible. So next to the opacity 0 that we add here, we should also add the pointer events none back. So that way, if we now click this button, we know that we click the Spotify card because all of the other ones are not clickable. And then you already see that the album images nicely fade out as well. And that leaves us with one thing left, and that's probably the coolest animation. That is moving the Spotify logo from one place to the other place. And you could simply move it to the left and down and scale it to get it in the right position. But I actually want to show Framer Motion's layout transitions here and let Framer Motion do this for you. And for that to work, we first need to also add this Spotify element to the full screen image as well. So let's go back to our card and copy the Spotify logo. And then we go to our visual and we also add that into our Spotify element. Then of course we need to position it correctly. So let me quickly grab the right positioning for it. Padding should only be 1 pixel in this case. And then you see that there's this Spotify element added in place. And what I now want to do is transition this element into the position of the other element. Or I want to do that. I want Framer Motion do that for us. And the way Framer Motion can do this for us is by using a property called layout ID. And in order to use that, we can't use a regular div anymore, but we need to use a motion.div. Because this motion.div automatically brings the layout ID property. So this layout ID, we could set to Spotify logo. And then we're gonna go into our card component as well, because they both need to be exactly the same layout ID. Motion.div. Then we import this again from Framer Motion. And that also makes this a motion.div. And then I'm gonna copy it so I don't make a typo. And then the only thing you have to do to let Framer Motion transition this is make sure that there's only one of the two visible at a time. And Framer Motion will then do the calculation and movement from one into the other. So we're gonna use this isFullScreen variable again. We're gonna say, if it's not full screen, then we want to show the logo in the card. Otherwise, we don't show it. And the other way around, let's copy the isFullScreen logic in as well. If we are full screen, then we want to show it in the large visual. And now, by only making sure that only one of the two is visible at a time, but they both have the exact same layout ID, Framer Motion will do the animation for us. There is nothing we have to do to make this work. Look. it just moves back and forth in place. It's crazy. There's a bit of quirks happening. You see that it has some issues with scaling a little bit. And there's currently a few issues in FrameRemotion on their GitHub page that it seems that they're working and aware of this. But I think it would be really valuable to show this solution instead of moving it manually to the left and scaling it down, because that's similar to our animation sequences. And this is something that really makes your animations a lot easier. So that's why I actually wanted to show you that this is also a possible solution, because this makes it a lot easier. You could even, for all of the other cards as well, just make sure you have two exactly the same diffs, and FrameRemotion animates it for you without you needing to know where this is exactly going. And that is a super powerful feature of FrameRemotion. There's still one small issue, and that is that if the element is focused, you can still scroll and you see all of the website's content overflowing. What you need to do for that is simply block the scrolling. And Amie does that by really preventing the scroll with JavaScript. I'm actually going to use Tailwind to add an overflow hidden class on the HTML node, which prevents you from scrolling at all. However, doing that also removes the scroll bar, and that would make everything move to the left and right because this 10 pixels is added additionally. So I'm actually using a small hook that adds both the class for the overflow, but also adds a small padding to the right side so you don't see that jump. I'm not gonna look at that hook in this video, maybe it's worth a separate video, but that's what I'm gonna use to prevent this scrolling from happening. And that hook you can find within utils and then toggle page overflow. So if we go to the app, I can simply add that hook in the site, and then we pass in a boolean. If we're full screen, then it should be hidden. If not, it should not be hidden, of course. And if you do that and scroll to the element, and we click the show me, you see that the scroll bar disappears and we can't scroll anymore. Until we go back, then everything works again. So that's a really nice addition, and the code you can definitely check yourself. But it's really necessary to make this work, otherwise you could still scroll, and that's really ugly, of course. The final thing I also still want to add is that you can press escape to also close this pop-up. But again, that's something that's beyond this video. So inside the utils directory, there's also a hook that you can give a function to run whenever the user presses escape. And that's also what I'm using to close this dialog, and definitely take a look there yourself as well. Let me quickly take in that hook too, because this then adds the final detail that I was still willing to add. So that way, if you click this button and press escape, it simply closes the layout again, and we get back to the normal view. And that sums up the whole rebuild of all of the Amie animations. And if we take one more look, I think we created something super beautiful. All of these cards that animate in, and then when you click the button, everything animates into place, all of the content animates out of the way, and back in place again when you click the button or press escape. And also looking at the code, I think, especially because we're using the animation sequences, it's quite structured in the way that all the animations work. You can see how everything works, and it's quite easy to tweak as well. I hope that these two videos showed you how you can recreate such animations with FrameRemotion yourself as well. And I really challenge you to make something yourself or recreate something that's not exactly this, but also something that's totally different, just to experiment with FrameRemotion and discover all of the amazing things you can create with it. If you want to experiment more with this, also check the link in the description as well, because in there you find a link to a live playground and all of the code that we just wrote. That way you can experiment with it yourself and try to come up with something new even. For example, experiment with creating all of the other cards. There's so much more that we could add to this. Also, maybe you can add the Spotify icon as well. Make a pull request on GitHub, and I will also just put it up on the website as well for others to learn from too. If you enjoyed this rebuild, definitely leave a like and also a comment down below, because that helps this channel a lot. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.